Hi, everyone, and welcome to this speaker workshop. This workshop is a guide for specifically economics and motions that relate to economics. And in workshop one, we'll be discussing mostly the building blocks, the conceptual kind of foundations for economics. So let's just jump into the introduction. A little bit about myself. My name is Asad Hussain Khan. I'm one of the chief adjudicators for the Senior Nationals 2025-2026, and I'm excited to see, really looking forward to seeing all the teams do well and produce some great debates over the weekend. As a speaker, I represented my school between 2007 and 2011. Essentially, in the last nationals I spoke was in the December of 2010. And I mentioned that because it partly informs one of the reasons why we're doing this workshop, or we've chosen this topic for doing for covering in the speaker workshop. But one of the reasons why we did this is because we got a lot of feedback from teams that economics is an issue, or as a theme, it gives a lot of issue to teams and speakers who are maybe not as familiar with the topic. The other reason for myself why I'm so interested in this topic and I want to discuss it a lot and make it a key focus whenever get the opportunity, is because I'm really interested in economics and in understanding it myself, improving kind of my conceptual grasp of foundational and advanced concepts, but also discussing it with other people. And part of that interest or part of that curiosity kind of comes from the time period in which I was debating. So if you've been following up with the news, or if you've been reading up with sort of historical financial history of recent times, you would know that 2007 2008 corresponds with the global financial crisis. So that's a very interesting time to be a student. That's a very interesting time to be a debater. I wouldn't say it's the best time to be either of those things, but conceptually, when you hear the news, when you read the news back in 2007 2008, I think 2008 was when Lehman Brothers declared their bankruptcy, and you read about how this institution that had net worth of billions of dollars, right? For context, at that time, Pakistan's net worth, sorry, not net worth, but gross domestic product, a term we'll look at in a bit, was maybe around $200 billion, maybe less than that. So when financial institutions are collapsing that had balance sheets or that had assets of higher than 200 billions, the entire GDP of my country, it just doesn't make sense what's happening. It's very difficult to make sense of that. Um, when you read up a little bit more, you find out that this has something to do with a housing crisis. And instinctively, I suppose, as a student, my thinking at least went to a crisis of deficit, right? Because that's how you generally think about economic crisis. But in fact, what's happening is that people are sort of foreclosing on their homes in that particular period. If you're not familiar with this history, we can go into details later, but essentially they're leaving their homes that they had mortgaged, and then they're going and renting somewhere else. So one of the indicators for the crisis is not lack of housing, it is that you have surplus housing, and that just it is so counterintuitive that it doesn't make any sense. So naturally, as a debater, as a student, I had to get into this space and I had to learn more about it. And I hope that in the next 20-30 minutes, we'll go through some foundational concepts that will make it easier for you to build up and then apply those concepts, a particular framework of thinking about economics, to more complicated motions. In workshop one, which is the exercise today, we'll be focusing on the foundational concepts, less so on debate motions or actual economic sort of real world historical events or phenomena that we can explain through that framework, because step one should always be building a framework. Some disclaimers that are relevant at this point. So the way we're talking about economics is not necessarily how it's taught in O&A level or undergraduate programs, and that's an important kind of distinction. There will be several sort of oversimplifying assumptions that I'll be making. Sometimes we'll be referring to topics or concepts in a kind of a rushed way that you would not see in a sort of textbook approach, because essentially this isn't and this exercise is not to help you pass your economics exam or to prepare you for an undergraduate or graduate degree. So just sort of keep that in mind. Number two is that while talking about how economies must have developed, or how economic innovations must have entered the social and political life of human civilization. I'll make a lot of remarks throughout the next hour where some sort of assumption about how XYZ must have come into place is stated. These are ahistoric comments. In most places, these are going to be ahistoric comments and are not going to be necessarily backed by definitive archaeological research or historical kind of research. So we'll see how that becomes relevant in a bit, but it's a kind of an important reminder to put in place. I'll try to make some comments based on archaeological records as well, but generally we're interested in this as an ahistoric exercise, so we don't necessarily have the burden of kind of um, being right on some of the history that we're discussing. We can just simply say that, for example, in the context of currency notes are inevitable and they must have come into place because a society would have needed XYZ functions and that those functions are filled by a currency. That's not necessarily a historic account of paper money, but it will do for the purposes of this discussion. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's look at what approach we're going to use. So in my view, in my advice to students, in my advice to fellow coaches, in my advice to fellow debaters, I say that you've got to really look at economics as a theme in a way that's similar to all other themes. And similarly, when it comes to economic motions, I would say the focus for you should be to think of them as any other debate motion. Maybe they require some knowledge that you would not maybe have covered in your everyday conversations or in your curriculum. But essentially, the basics are the same. And just like with any social contract theory motion or political authority or political obligation motion, the steps are the same as well. So first, we've got to build a simple model. And then we add complications to it. So if we're discussing a motion about political authority, we start with a very simplistic view of a society. We discuss something like a social contract, and then we try to sort of build layers of complications or layers of analysis on top of that. So we're going to try and do that in this exercise today as well. And the other thing that becomes important is that before we start just jumping into an argument, before we start saying, oh, the Marxists are really terrible and they don't know anything about economics, or before we say that trickle down economics is a hoax created by liberal economists, before we start the argumentative part, we've got to build some sort of familiarity with the concepts that we're dealing with. There's obviously nothing wrong with taking a position on a debate or a subject or a topic on economics, but just as in the case of a technology debate or a debate around political order, you would your ability to take that position or to your ability to provide nuanced analysis in support or in contradiction to a particular position would be much improved if you were on solid conceptual ground when you were talking about this. Okay, so that's kind of what's going to inform my approach today. Let's move on to the definitions that are kind of important. You will see a lot of definitions are just left empty. What I'm hoping is that after the end of this workshop, you'll be able to fill these on your own. But there are some that we need to start with. So the first thing that has to obviously be talked about is economics, and you see two textbook definitions that are right there up on top. You can read them out. The first one says economics is a social science primarily concerned with analyzing the choices that individuals, business, governments, and nations make to allocate limited resources. And another way of defining this is that it's a social science that studies the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. So I'm going to take a little bit of a digression before continuing with with the session plan. Um, One thing that I used to think about as a student, and one thing that sometimes come up is well, what makes economics particularly distinct, right? Because the definitions that you see in the ones that I've just read out, um, a lot of subjects study similar choices, right? Um, they might not be entirely devoted to the study of such phenomena, but you would see in sociology choices being made by individuals and businesses, or rather individuals and governments in many contexts. In politics, the question of distribution and consumption of goods is an important question. It's not the only question, but it is an important question. So, what is it about economics that makes it so distinct? And one of the things that you will see if especially if you're interested in studying it at an academic level, is that it looks at situations in a sort of marginal way. So all the actors that are involved in making decisions are sort of marginally improve or making decisions on a marginal sort of day-to-day or hour-to-hour basis. And the relevance of that might be a bit difficult to illustrate right now, but you will see going forward that a lot of time the economists would kind of look at how a situation develops with each marginal step. So that's just something to keep in mind as we move forward. That leads us to the question of what is an economy. That's again, you have the dictionary definition right here. It's an area of production, distribution, and trade, as well as consumption of goods and services. And it helps to think about the economy as a space rather than a geographical area. So maybe you can look at it that way. But just make sure that you're not confusing or conflating what what a government budget, for example, is with the economy. As we'll see, government is a part of the economy, of course, and its economic decisions or its economic actions are important for the economy. But there's an economy. The economy of Pakistan is not just the budget of the Pakistani government, for example. So if there are any sort of conceptual sort of things to discuss here or add here, you can reach out to me on my email, and if you have any questions, you can share. But it's very important that we understand that economy is maybe like the sum total of what we're doing as a society, and not just the actions of the government. That's a confusion that often comes up when I discuss this, so I'm just flagging it right here. Okay, moving on. Um, we also need to have some sense of what aggregate production is. This isn't really a term that's often used. You usually use the terms aggregate supply and demand, but I haven't discussed supply and demand, so I'll use this makeshift term for a bit. It's also called, when we talk about countries, we also refer to this as gross domestic product, which is basically the sum of all the goods and services that have been produced. So you'll notice all three of these definitions kind of rely on goods and services. Let's take one part of it. Let's stick to goods so that we have a sort of simpler time. And let's see what that would actually look like before we try to fill in the definitions for the other terms in this on this list. So again, remember the approach that we were going to use was that we would take any situation, we'll try to construct a very simple model of something, in this case, an economy, and then we'll take it from there. So we'll try to add um, complications or more analysis once we've got the simple picture right. Okay, so let's start with what an economy or what the simplest of economies would look like. So let's go far back in time. Let's think about again, let's take an ahistoric look at at a simplistic caveman economy or hunter-gatherer economy, and what their decisions to consume, produce goods and services would have looked like. So let's imagine that you have the very earliest sort of pre-modern human beings. Let's sort of impute posit certain conditions that would be important for those human beings. So one of the things is that they would need something for their survival. They would need to eat. They would need they need some kind of clothing, etc., etc. They would need water, right? And let's also imagine or assume that in nearest surroundings, they have certain things which can fulfill those requirements. So their nutritional demands can be met by berries and meat that they can hunt. So they can, hunt deer or gazelles or whatever, and they can forage for berries. And they can cut down trees to make a fire or construct primitive housing, and from the skins or from whatever the sources, they can come up with some kind of clothing. Um, we start with the assumption. The first assumption is that you may have started from societies where every member tried to do every one of these things. Right. So everyone was kind of fending for themselves. This might not be a very historic account, but it's as conceptually it's very illustrative. And then what people would have realized, the participants in this society or this economy would have realized, is that that's probably not the most efficient way of working, because not everyone has the natural physical frame to be a lumberjack. Not everyone is very good at collecting berries, and hunters require some degree of specialization. So you could have maybe five members of such an economy. They might all know how to hunt, but one of them might be better than the other four. And so what that leads to is, we imagine that it would have inevitably created a division of labor. There's some archaeological evidence to suggest that pre-modern societies um, did in fact specialize in certain things. So maybe this isn't completely off track, but we don't need to involve ourselves with that academic discussion. So with these assumptions and with this groundwork laid, what we imagine is that a four-person economy where person A specializes in cutting down trees and shaping the wood in such a way that it can be used for lighting a fire, um, and or building houses, etc., etc. Person D starts to collect berries, and that's what they do every day. Person C is a hunter, so they go out and hunt. And person B, let's say, works on something else. We'll say that they work on clothing or something. Okay, so in this particular case, what is going to be their the equivalent of their GDP? We throw around this term in the context of Pakistan ka GDP is XYZ, but for economy A, what will that be? So you can pause the video and think about it. If you already know the answer, then maybe we can write it out. So their aggregate production, or their GDP, is 100 units of lumber, 200 units of berries, 150 units of hunted meat, and 10 units of clothing. Um, Okay, so that's what GDP is. That's what aggregate production is. And a lot of when we say the growth or decline in GDP, in the context of this very simplistic model, we're talking about increases and decreases in this number. And similarly, when we are talking about comparing two economies, let's say there's an economy B that produces more stuff on a daily basis, that works in the same commodities or in the same goods, but produces more of those goods. We say the GDP, or the aggregate production of economy B, is higher than that of economy A. And so we can maybe sometimes make the simplistic statement that economy B is bigger than economy A. Uh, Technically, that's what we would be saying, is that it produces more goods than economy A. For this model to function, we also assume that people involved in this economy are sort of doing simple trades with each other. So the lumberer just doesn't need lumber; they also need berries and clothing and hunt. So they exchange in some barter fashion, which is they give some of the extra lumber that they have that they don't need, and get the extra berries at some exchange rate, which is justified or fair. But let's not get into what that would be. So I hope we now know we have a good understanding of what aggregate production is. In a more complicated economy such as ours, obviously the picture wouldn't be as simple. You would have tens of thousands of industries. You would have multiple other kinds of economic actors to deal with. But we don't want to jump to the model of a complicated economy just right now. We want to sort of slowly build our way over there. So I've already alluded to growth and contraction, and that those are some of the terms as well in the definitions page. So let's look at what that would look like. What makes an economy grow? So let's say economy A is, just like we looked at the previous sheet or previous tab, is has an aggregate production of 200 berries, 100 lumber, 150 hunt, 10 clothing, etc., etc. There's some assumptions that we will make here now, which are important. One of them is that all of these goods are sort of traded daily. So whatever people need, they settle their accounts on a daily basis. And so they spend the morning maybe hunting and foraging and lumbering or sewing, and then at in the evening they trade with each other and get what they need. We're also assuming that all goods are they don't decay over time, which is obviously not true, but let's make that assumption as an illustrative point. So what will get these guys um, to grow their primitive GDP, and how does that actually play out? There are a number of ways to think about this, but one of the interesting things about markets, or one of the interesting thing about economies, is they often have a lot of sort of intrinsic factors that propel them in the direction of growth. So if here, what becomes important is to understand the difference between production and capacity. So let's say the person who's the forager, right, is someone who can actually forage a lot more, right? But they don't make that decision because they feel that the extra berries are not really required by anyone else. Or let me give you a different example. Let's say the lumberer actually has the capability of producing more units of lumber, but they don't do so because they don't see really a reason. The more lumber they would add, it's not like they're going to get more berries for it, because they think the berries production is limited based on how much foraging area is around them. So their decision to produce at their capacity or produce more really depends on how other people are going to, other participants in this economy are going to behave or act. So, essentially, or the technical way of saying this is that a lot depends on their future expectations from the economy, and specifically the actors around them. So, let's say what happens if you change that assumption that person A has. Let's say you give credible information to person A that due to maybe some exogenous factors or outside factors, person D would be actually be able to harvest or collect or forage a lot more berries than they did today. And maybe there's a reason for this. Maybe they found a new area where you have a lot of berries, or maybe person D has come up with a new way of collecting them, whatever. But what would that mean for the person who is producing lumber, right? Now that it gives them a significant um, incentive to increase their production by a corresponding sort of ratio, with a corresponding ratio, so that they can exchange those for the berries that are being offered. They could also just keep at their production level, but that would just mean that the extra berries are, not utilized, and person D also stays at their capacity. So if person A has a genuine sort of belief, or they're confident that person D is actually going to increase their um, uh, uh, production, or their supply, or their work rate, a person A will respond in a similar fashion. What would that mean for the other participants? What would that mean for the day after tomorrow? Well, if person A is producing more, not only do they have more to offer to the market, but their demand, or their capacity to want more things, also increases. And similarly, so you now have more berries, and you now have more lumber. So for person C, it makes a lot more sense for them to increase their output, so that they can make a claim to either of these goods, or enter the market and offer a better exchange, at a rate at which the person who's producing the extra berries gives some of those trade some of those berries with person C, and not just with person A, who have already adjusted their production to a higher level. So this can be a little bit convoluted, but essentially, this is the important realization here, is that sometimes what you need to do to increase an economy is kind of grow confidence amongst all the participants in that economy, that everyone else would put in more work tomorrow. So that means that they would put in more work tomorrow. Sometimes these are just intrinsic factors, right? So someone just comes up with a way of doing things better, and assures people that they will have more product tomorrow, or the next year, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes those incentives have to do with uh, external factors, such as natural factors that enable more foraging or more collection, etc., etc. Um, the other thing to remember is that there doesn't necessarily need to be a huge, like, communication between these parties. Like, they don't need to sit down and coordinate and plan this. So even if person C is not aware of what person D, the increase in person D's collection rate, right? Just the fact that there are that the person who has more berries and more lumber now want more hunt, or they're placing more orders for the hunted meat, gives an indication to person C that they can comfortably increase their production, right? So they don't even need to know that this economic boom happened because person D found a better way of harvesting. They just need to receive more orders from the person who sells lumber, right? Who provides lumber, to know that it's safe for them to produce hunt. So there's this kind of cyclical, virtuous cycle that kind of kickstarts. You can see, imagine that this will have an effect on person B, and on, if there are more participants in this economy, on those persons, to increase their economic production. So both these takeaways are really important and very interesting to kind of note. And I hope they give you a way of thinking about economic growth that helps you cover more complicated analyses that we'll discuss maybe in a separate workshop. Okay, so what else could change? So this was a situation where person D just did more work and other people responded to it. You could also have situations where the level of specialization in an economy reaches a stage where you can add people who are producing materials which are maybe not directly consumable, but they help other people do their tasks better. So these guys need to be fed and clothed by the existing specialists, right, who are producing goods that have an intrinsic value, that are needed, that you need for consumption, and they're spending their time coming up with things which may not be consumed directly, which are not there for consumption, but they help you do other things well, which helps you consume more. So an example of that could be, human societies coming up with the spear, which means that the hunter faction in that economy, or the hunter participants in that economy, don't have to, have face-to-face kind of combat with, uh, with game that is much stronger or larger than them. They can in fact at a distance make their hunt. Another innovation that's often cited is wooden axes, right? So when you have basic metal work, and you can combine that into making a wood axe, that really helps the people who are working on lumbering, and so they can produce a lot more. And you would imagine that if all else is equal, another term that we use in economics a lot, it would lead to kind of the virtuous cycle that we looked in the previous tab. And people would respond to those incentives. And if they were producing below their capacity, they would start producing more of whatever they were producing. Some innovations are don't necessarily have to involve even a new specialist. They might just be better ways of doing something. So the innovation which allowed for better baskets, which, again, human societies take some time to evolve to that situation, but archaeological evidence suggests that at some point you come up with, better pots, clay pots, or carrying material that helps you forage more effectively. That you come up with hunting strategies that actually mean you hunt a lot more effectively. So, luring, for example, a pack of oxen to a hidden trap, instead of kind of hunting them one by one. That those are, again, those kind of innovations and technological advances help a lot, help one faction a lot. Maybe they're localized, maybe they're specific, but the important thing is that, just like we discussed in the previous sheet, the the innovation might relate to products which the other participants aren't necessarily involved with, but the impact is same. They can step up their production, assuming they're not already at capacity, and produce more, which would mean that the aggregate production of the entire economy improves or becomes higher. People have more to consume, people have more to enjoy. And we say that in a net terms, we can also suggest that it is a positive thing. Although, again, there are limitations of how much you should rely on GDP as a measure of prosperity. But more on that later. Okay, now let's look. So these were virtuous cycles. One of them we looked at was had an intrinsic reason, people just deciding to do more, right? And the other had some exogenous factor, some innovation, some change that related to how people were doing the things that they were doing. So let's look at what happens when you have the opposite happening, when you have vicious cycles. And this is very important to kind of understand, especially when we look at um, government structures, when we look at when we try to come up with a conceptual justification for government intervention, or some framework for why governments should exist. So again, let's say there's economy A today, right? And it is at the same level as we saw in the previous slide. and some kind of shock happens, some external factor or some exogenous factor goes wrong, which means that there is a sudden impact on the value of berries, right? On the sort of amount, quantity or amount of berries. So you have a lot fewer berries, right? What would that do for the trade or the exchange rate for berries? Um, in the short run, their value would increase. The person D would sell them at a higher rate because on this particular day, they have fewer goods than other individuals. So whatever the price rate was, let's say it was two berries to one lumber, it will now go to maybe 1 to 1 ratio. Right, so they're making more in a sense, or they're having to sell less to get the same amount. So person A and person C really can't respond to that. They are having a little bit of a trouble here. Before maybe the lumberer could give 50 units of lumber and get 100 berries. They certainly can't do that now because the exchange rate would have shifted. So they're getting less value for the work that they're putting in. Now, let's assume they can't force person D to change what has happened. Maybe it's beyond person D's control because the reason has to do with an exogenous factor. So what kind of response do they have? Well, on this day, not much. There's not much they can do about it. They'll just have to take it in their stride. But tomorrow you will see them adjusting. So you will see them sort of responding to the incentives that have come in. So an extra hour of labor, for example, for them would not make much of a sense. So they would reduce their quantities as well. What happens when person A does it? Well, certainly that sends a really negative message to person C because they don't need to hunt more because all the extra hunt that they're getting would just lower the price or lower the sort of value of their hard work. So might as well have some free time, maybe spend it on other tasks, on the non-specialist tasks that this tribe still has to do, such as building their huts or fetching water or I suppose spending time with their families and whatnot, right? And so when that happens, what sort of signal does it send to person B? Well, it tells them that there isn't much point in working an extra hour or working an extra 2 hours because the produce that they're making isn't really fetching the kind of value or fetching the kind of goods for them as it was doing day before yesterday. So again, the people who are affected, the people who are contracting their production, who are reducing their production, might not even be directly dealing with the guy who makes berries. It's very much possible that person B doesn't even like berries and only deals with person C. But the sort of cyclical effect of a shock or a contraction in production by one stakeholder can often have a chain reaction which affects multiple other people in the economy, and that's a very important sort of point to take away from this. Once again, if this has been an explanation that is oversimplistic or has glossed over things and you have questions or there are certain things that I've said which just don't make sense to you, feel free to reach out to me on my email, and I'd use that feedback to improve this presentation and maybe incorporate that in the next workshop or another sort of take of this workshop. Okay, so this is kind of important. We have learned a couple of things. One of the things that we have learned is that you can have intrinsic and extrinsic reasons. So you can have internal reasons for growth and the opposite of growth, which is shrinkage or contraction. The other thing we've learned is that you can have exogenous shocks or exogenous sort of external positives that can spur cycles of growth. The third thing we've learned is that technological changes or the manner in which you do things really helps you kind of improve your improves your ability to produce more and improves your GDP, et cetera, et cetera. And the fourth thing that we've learned is whether it is a regardless of whether it's a positive external factor or an negative internal factor, an economy the people who are affected by it or the people who decrease or increase their production do not necessarily need to be directly tied to that product. So the shock may be experienced by people who are producing berries, but it will and they might not be directly trading with people who work on making clothing or footwear, but through a chain reaction they get affected as well. We also know that this chain reaction is cyclical because if everyone's producing less, that has this kind of ripple effect, this domino effect, and you have a cycle of contraction. Okay, so let's take a bit of a pause here, and then we go to sort of maybe complicating this version of the economy a little bit more. So now that we know what it means for to say that a certain economy is bigger or smaller, we now have some understanding of some foundational kind of way of thinking about um, GDP or growth in an economy or shrinkage in an economy. Let's move on to some other stuff. Let's try to make this simple model more complicated, a little bit more realistic, a little bit closer to the real world. So one of the things that often characterizes modern economies has to do with paper currency or money. And that's a very important kind of component, especially when you look at government policy, monetary frameworks, monetary theory, and monetary policy. Something that's a bit of a hot topic these days with whatever is happening between Donald Trump and Jeremy Powell. So let's look at what let's look at some of the foundations here. Again, this might not be a very historic account of how things might have went down, but we can assume that that societies would have started from some kind of barter system. There's some evidence to suggest that as well. But we also know that barter systems are deeply inefficient. And the technical term for or the technical sort of phrase that describes the problem with barter systems is that they require a double coincidence of needs or wants, which is simplest to say that a trade will only happen if the both the parties have what they each other need. But even with like a four-person economy, that may not always be true. So you might have this kind of chain of cycle where A needs something from D, but D needs something from B, B needs something from C, and C needs something from A. So this kind of it would be difficult to make a direct transaction for any of the participants. They would have to come together. They would have to make a four-way transaction because no one wants to kind of A wouldn't want to give lumber to C and unless they knew that the hunt that they're getting in exchange would be taken from them by B, and then B wouldn't do that if they knew that they would get some that or and then it sorry then A would have to run the risk of will have a lot of clothing, and they will have to know for sure that D would take that clothing from them at a pre-agreed exchange rate. Otherwise they would just suffer a lot of losses. So it might be safer for everyone to not make a trade or make very selective trades or make trades of very small amount, which in terms of economics we say is inefficient. It holds people back. It might be one of the reasons why they don't produce a lot more, because if they were to produce a lot more closer to their capacity, they don't have a reliable way of trading that. And you can already see that maybe with four people that might be easier to still, coordinate. But as we increase that number, let's say we even take it to 20, and we introduce more sort of complications such as people needing two, three things at the same time and not just one commodity, a simplifying assumption we've made here, you see that the system becomes very difficult to kind of operate. So again, so what would people do? Well, presumably, and again, with some limited archaeological data or backing this, we can imagine that, or we can assume that such societies or such economies would have adopted one of the commodities as a currency. Probably this would be a commodity that is fairly stable in supply, so it's not like meat, it isn't, or hunt, it isn't, subject to a lot of unpredictability on a daily basis. But in fact, it is something that's a little bit reliable. So every day you'll have X amount of lumber up for trade. It is probably something that doesn't decay easily if you relax the decay assumption, right? Because in real world, things actually do go bad or go to waste. It's probably something that everyone needs, right? So these are the conditions that a commodity would have to meet. And so historically, you would see maybe salt serving that purpose in a lot of societies because you could use salt, everyone needed salt, and it would become this method of exchange that would mean you would, make trades in that. This still has a limitation, So you are still limited by the supply of that commodity. And if that shrinks suddenly, if let's say for whatever reason you run out of trees to cut down, suddenly if you were using lumber as your currency, all the prices will change. And that will introduce a lot of unpredictability to exchange rates, and it will again have the impact of making trades difficult. There's another issue there as well, because what we're essentially looking at is not just we need a currency not just as a method of exchange, but another function that it can serve, or that we would like it to serve, is that it becomes a store of value. So we would want it to be a little bit of a reliable kind of thing. And that really matters when we're looking at exchanges over time, not just in one shot or in one day, but same exchanges, similar exchanges taking place tomorrow or the day after. I mean by that is maybe the person who's produced more berries doesn't really need the lumber right now. But if lumber is a good store of value, if it's a predictable kind of currency, they can produce more, right? More berries, get more lumber, right? They don't need anything today, but maybe tomorrow they can use the lumber that they have in surplus, right? And use it to get more hunt, even if tomorrow they haven't produced more berries. So essentially, the surplus that they have created um, it gets converted into stable value if they have a reliable currency. And sometimes a commodity as a currency cannot really serve that function, even if it is even if it is enabling easy transfer and exchange. It fails on the second um, second criteria, or the second function. So we move to step three, which is basically, and there's interesting way that this innovation could have come about in societies. Again, this is a lot of assumptions going into sparse data available, but the idea is that when people started adopting commodities which were very stable in supply, maybe not required as much for consumption, but very stable in supply, they would have hit upon silver and gold. Again, there's data backing this. And then at some point, societies begin to realize that, well, look, it's a bit cumbersome carrying pieces of gold around and making trades in those. Minting gold coins of a particular size, or gold bars of a particular size, requires a lot of quantity checks and assurance. So how about I just issue a note paper to that says I have given X amount of gold to this particular person, and all my gold is in safekeeping with a primitive bank. And so that person can just go to that institution and get that gold that way. They won't have to rely on sort of checking the currency that I'm giving them. They'll just have that paper. The paper will be authentic, and then they can go to the financial intermediary, whoever that is, whoever stores the gold, and take it from them. So that's maybe one way that societies evolved to this particular innovation. But the idea is that you have a loan, or that you have a paper that says, well, I'm giving you equivalent of X commodity for this particular transaction to get, let's say, X units of lumber or X units of berries. And however, in this system, the value of that currency is strictly tied to that particular commodity. So if you have a paper that signifies 1 unit of lumber, the value of that 1 unit of lumber is still defined by the exchange rate that you have with berries. And that can sometimes be a very limiting factor, especially if you can't fractionalize, right? So if you can only issue one note against one lumber, and you only have 100 pieces of lumber, then the overall supply of notes, or oversupply of paper currency, would be limited, which is a limiting factor if we are expecting real growth tomorrow and we're trying to lock that in today. What does that mean? That means that if the person who is selling berries wants to invest in something that helps them collect berries in a more effective way, they need the money now to make that investment. They need the paper currency now to make that investment, to pay off the hunter, or the person who makes the clothing, or the craftsman who's making this innovation for them, whatever that innovation is. We don't really need to go into specifics now. And they're limited by it because the total number of currency notes is limited to just 100, or some to equivalent of 100 lumber units. So, so that limitation is completely addressed by something that's called a fiat paper currency. So here you again you need a government for this. This is the first sort of instance where we are, um, we really require a government because otherwise the fiat of that currency or the value that it has by itself would not really be enforceable if you didn't have a government. It would be very unlikely for fiat currency to exist without governments, and I can't think of any examples where that has actually happened. And what essentially that would mean is that you will have a government issuing notes against its own sort of assets or against its own assurance that that paper currency is worth something, and that can then be used by people for their particular transactions. So the government can increase the supply of that note, something that's called expansionist monetary policy, and that can help the person who is investing in tomorrow to get more notes to buy things from person C and person B. Like, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to have an expansionist monetary policy? Why would you want to have more notes circulating in your economy? Is something that that maybe we'll cover in workshop two. But it's a central one of the two key ways in which the government interferes or intervenes with an economy, and it definitely deserves a lot of attention. And you see a lot of debates and topics around this idea as well. Should this level of monetary easing or expansion be determined by the elected government, and should it be left to technocrat? Because if you're fairly familiar with this question, the example that I've just given of how having more paper currency helps economic growth because it helps person D take on more loans or invest in tomorrow. You also know that the effect of increasing more loan notes is that it increases the demand for certain items, but the supply of those items remains consistent. So if you print a lot more notes, you need more dollars to buy 1 unit of hunt because the unit of hunt doesn't increase. So the expansion, the increasing the monetary supply or increasing the number of paper notes that are floating or circulating in an economy also leads to something that is called inflation, right? So why is it that governments or people or technocrats even sometimes are risking inflation, and what's the interlink of that with the broader economic management objectives has to do with stuff that I would like to cover in workshop number two. But I hope that the basic framework is accessible to you after this workshop. And again, you can leave any questions if you would like. So yeah, so that's where the concept of that's what a very foundational, very simplistic framework for paper currency or money comes from. Let's move on to constructing a similar model for markets. We all hear that term. We all know we have some sense of what it refers to. Let's take a deep dive into what that means in terms of economics and what are some of the interesting things that we can develop our notions around and then use them in different debates. I'll try and make this a little bit more debate specific than the coverage that I've done up until this point. So I hope you'll have a you'll find this insightful. Okay, let's move on. So what is a market? A market is a place where price is determined. And this is a very interesting definition. I should credit the people who came up with this definition. I'll do that when I send the slides across. But essentially, it's a collection of buyers and sellers that this is very interesting. Through their actual or potential interactions, are determining the price of a product or a set of products or services, etc., etc. Okay, so that's the definition. I hope that means something to everyone who's reading it. But what does it specifically mean? And particularly, what I'm interested in finding out is if someone's job is to sell apples in a fruit market, how do they set the per kg price, right? And in economics, we'll just look at demand supply curves. In economics, you have multiple ways of kind of trying to predict how price would move, and you have like a lot of calculus that goes into making such predictions. But the person whose job is to sell apples doesn't really have the time or capacity or capability to run advanced calculus, and a lot of times that advanced calculus is also just plain wrong. And so how is it that someone who's selling apples knows what price to set? Well, one of the assumptions that you can have is that there is really no set price for an apple, and in fact you have just everyone doing random things. But in fact, you can check this from your personal experience. If you go to a fruit market and ask people around for how much a kilogram of apple costs, you'll find some variation for sure. Some of it because not all apples are the same, they're not homogeneous, but you will find a particular range, right? And if you're a discerning buyer, you would be able to kind of figure out that a particular variety of apples is going to trade between 300 or 400 rupees, right? Or 300 and 350 rupees. And that sort of average or mid range would actually be surprisingly consistent all across the market. So some kind of price determination is taking place that doesn't require advanced mathematics or advanced science or probability theory or calculus, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of important that we deal with this question head first. And I want to give you a little bit of an anecdote myself. When I started working like professionally, one of the things that we were working on with the people that I was working with was to make a ride-hailing application. This was back in 2016, 2017, and what they were trying to do, what the development team was sort of figuring out was if there is a shortage of people who have who are driving, who are the captains, and there's a surplus of people who need transportation. How do you increase the price multiplier such that more people start driving in that area, and the people who are driving earn a little bit more, their incentive increases. Um, Uber had already cracked this case, Kareem had already cracked this case, and back then they used to be very explicit and transparent with how the pricing was working. So if you were stuck in an area where there were very few drivers, your price multiplier you would see it go up to 1.1 or 1.25 or 1.5. So if a normal journey would have cost you 500 rupees, at 1.5 the multiplier you'd have to pay 750. Now they don't show it anymore. I think they just give you a notification that the price is usually higher than usual because there's a lot more demand for cars. Sometimes some apps don't even do that. But so I asked the development team how they were trying to do that, and they talked about how they're going to take some sort of log of the distance, and then they're going to divide it by the number of people available, and this and that, et cetera, et cetera. And I wasn't sure how to proceed from there, but essentially the people that I was working with, my team, essentially came back to this question. Okay, look, what we're trying to do is essentially we're trying to determine the price. That happens every day in some of the most, unsophisticated markets all over the world, even in our country, in, thousands, hundreds of thousands of interactions every day. So it cannot possibly involve very complicated science or maths. It has to be something very simple. So, or something that's fairly accessible that everyone can do. So let's start with this sort of hypothetical walk across what that journey would look like for someone who sells Apple. To make it simple, let's say they get the purchase price is zero. Let's just imagine they get 100 kgs of apple at price zero. Obviously, that's not the case. People don't give apples away for free. But just to make it clear, you can call it X for all you care, and we can call the purchase price or the first price that you sell um, as 100. Now, either this price, what I've done is by taking this kind of shot in the dark, is I have either hit the kind of jackpot and exactly come up with the price for which an apple should trade, or I have not. And what has happened as a result? So what would happen as a result? So let's say I set this particular price, and this price is too high, right? What kind of function? What would tell me as someone in a fruit market that I've set a price that's too high, assuming that I can't look around and look at other apple sellers, right? So I only have information for myself, right? That's a very important key theme. For every sort of framework that we try to develop, we look at the informational requirement for it to happen, just as in sort of boom and bust cycles. We looked at how people would reduce their production or increase their production due to signals that even when they're not directly related to where a problem or an exogenous shock took place. Similarly, over here, we need to come up with a way where price determination happens at the level of a seller without giving them extra information, without having to assume more information than the one that's directly available to them. Okay, so you can pause the video at this point and you can think about what would happen that would indicate to me that I've actually got it wrong and I have set a price that's too high. Okay. So one of the things that's going to happen is you people will just not buy from you. So if you started with 100 kilograms of apple, you will have you'll have a lot of them left after let's say you started selling them at 9 a.m. and you're going to work till 5 a.m. So halfway through that point at 1 p.m. you realize that instead of having sold half of your quantity, you've actually sold only 10%. So that means that at this rate, people aren't interested in buying from you. There isn't a lot of demand. There aren't people who are willing and able to purchase at that price, which is the technical definition of demand. So what does that lead to you to as a realization? Well, the realization is price is too high, right? So you got this information not because you did some kind of theoretical physics exercise or calculation, but just the simple realities of a marketplace. So what would you do if the price is too high? And here again, the distinct sort of value of economics as a framework becomes important because an economist is going to assume that actors are going to work marginally. Now you don't know what the right set of price is, right? But you do know that your best bet, just as the conclusion we reached with the ride hailing model, is not to come up with some kind of logarithmic question, but to just make an incremental marginal decrease or increase as the case may be and see where that takes us. So your second selling price would be some, sort of decrease in if that is of a minor enough value that it doesn't shake things completely, but it makes something of a real difference. So maybe you will shave off, 25 rupees from your price, and you will sell the apples at whatever the value you purchased it and at 75. And let's say over here you're able to sell all of your all of the produce, all of the quantity that you wanted to sell. So we know that this price is just right. Okay. So again, you didn't have to do any complicated maths to get to this realization. So essentially, we know that x plus 75 is the right sort of price. We also call this the equilibrium price, where whatever we want to sell matches what people want to buy. The flip side of this case would be a situation where, let's say, you had started from a different situation where you had started from, let's say x plus 50, which we know is like we know people are willing to pay more for this. So what would have happened here? You would have gotten, and again, you can pause this and review, but what you would have gotten is you would have gotten too much demand for what you were selling, and the conclusion you would have reached is that the price is too low. And so consequently, your ability, your what you would have, in you what you would have realized is maybe you can't make all the adjustments right now, but tomorrow you will sell it at a slightly higher price, or in the second half of the market, you will increase your price again in a limited increment of 25 only, just to see if that is the right price. If it turns out that X plus 75 isn't the right price, you will still see more demand than what you needed. You will see maybe not as much as when price was X plus 50, but you will still get a lot more bids and interest from buyers then you have the ability to meet them. And so you will know you have to increase the price another increment. So by marginally moving uh, on the spectrum, you will hit the equilibrium at some point. And if you overshoot, you can of course correct in the next increment. You can decrease instead of increase, or increase instead of decrease, and kind of iterate your way towards that equilibrium. And that's a very important sort of foundational concept that comes up in a lot of debates and discussion. I may not be able to kind of make those links right now, but I'll hope that some of the things in workshop to sort of refer to this. Okay, so this is the kind of micro view. This is the view from the perspective of a seller, from the perspective of a participants in the economy. What would the macro view look like, right? So let's say let's say that we have only one commodity and we're interested in its price setting, and those are apples, let's say. So we know that from a macro level, when we were selling them too high, right, there was a lot of demand for this, and we couldn't really supply that much, right? So we know that at 50, the demand is quite higher than what we have to produce, right? We know that at 75, we were able to clear all our inventory. So at 75, the value is maybe the demand is 100, in the sense that people now, obviously, when you increase the price, not everyone can purchase, or people purchase less because they have other things to spend their money on. So you see the demand dropping to 100. When we set the price at X plus 100, we know that we weren't getting as much orders. We weren't able to clear our inventory. So maybe the demand is lower than 100. We might not necessarily know what it is, but we don't need to know that. We can, just as a participant, we really don't need to know that. Economists would be interested in calculating this particular function. This is called the demand function, and normally it is plotted in terms of a sort of chart along with supply function that looks something like this. I Again, because this is not economics 101 for O level or A level, so we're going to look at it in a tabular way, and hopefully that will make a lot of sense. So that's how demand functions. And as you can see, as you increase the price, the demand for that commodity or that good declines. But supply works the other way around. Why is that? Why is it that supply works differently? In fact, you will see over here that as you increase the price, the supply increases. It has a positive function. It increases with the price. You can pause this video, think about it a little bit if you don't already know the answer, and resume once you've generated some thoughts on this. Okay, so the answer is that again, from the perspective of the person who sells apples, right? If let's say the price starts to increase, if price goes to 100, and or rather X plus 100, then they make more profit off of this, right? So there is more reason for the apple vendor to procure more apples when they go to the fruit market next, or whoever their supplier is, or when they go to the orchards from where the apples come, right? So, or if they don't increase their production, the profit for other people to do so increases. So at X plus 100, maybe there are two producers, the two apple sellers who make the effort of waking up very early, going to an orchard, buying the apples at price X, and then, coming all the way to the fruit market in the city. And so you have 150 kgs of supply at that level. We obviously don't have that kind of demand, so there'll be a surplus, but you can see why supply would be a bit higher. What happens when you decrease the price to X plus 75? Well, there isn't a lot of reason for people to invest their time and energy in gathering apples and supplying them to the city fruit market. So maybe some of them drop out, or the people who are working on this realize that it's not worth that much. So they decrease their supply, they move it to 100. And similarly, if you were to decrease the price further, their incentive to work would decrease further, because they have to do a lot of effort, but they're not getting the same kind of reward for it. And this is especially true if X doesn't vary a lot. The original price, the price from the farm or the orchard, doesn't vary a lot. Then the supply function you would see being much more steep, right? Um, and so what we realize is that through the interactions of the market, whatever the equilibrium rate is, that is reached and the price is determined, which is what the sort of foundational definition was. So I hope that that's kind of clear. I know it's a little bit of a difficult concept to wrap around, but essentially, when you go to the most sort of complicated modern, I don't know, derivative selling on Reuters or Bloomberg, what is happening is essentially this. You might not be selling apples, you might be dealing with extremely complicated financial derivatives. But at the end of the day, the value of that derivative, through a lot more complicated, whatever complicated maths lies behind it, whatever complicated financial innovation lies behind it, would kind of get determined by this. There would be bankers and financial institutions on working on trading softwares, and they would be assessing what kind of demand and supply they're getting, and they would be reaching some kind of determination of an equilibrium price at which that demand and supply is met. Again, they don't need to know this ahead of the time, what the right price is. They can just sort of stumble their way to that through their actual or potential interactions. Okay. Um, so this this foundational information is kind of like important for the next discussion on markets, and this time I'll try to tie this in with actual kind of debates that you see. So one of the debates that you see is in favor of price ceilings and price caps. This is also one of the definitional items for this session. So hopefully after this workshop, you'll be able to you'll have no problem figuring out what a ceiling or price is. Okay, so we had already looked at the concept of government. So let's say there's a politically motivated sort of party. Let's say that's the government. Let's say that's someone else um, who just wants people to have apples at a lower rate. Or maybe let's say this is a more staple commodity. Let's say this is wheat, right? So we're not talking about apple, we're talking about wheat, and people can't go without wheat. So there's a political government that wants to keep people happy. It wants to show that it's doing a good job, whatever those reasons are. Or it just generally feels that the people really do need wheat to survive. It's really a question of survival. It's not just a political question, but it's actually a question of hunger and caloric fulfillment, etc., etc. And they realize that actually what you need is you want people to be the sort of true demand, the true requirement or need of the populace is 150 kilograms. And at current price, that's not that's not really being met because you have a lot of the people cannot actually purchase it. So a lot of the people cannot afford X plus 75. So what's happening is they're not really getting their fair share of the wheat, and they're losing out on this market because the people more well off than them who are purchasing all of the wheat away at a higher price. So what does the government do? Well, one thing that it can do is set up a price ceiling, and it can say the price is now fixed at X plus 50 rupees, right? And so they add a ceiling over here. Okay. So no supplier in the market can sell it for X plus 50. And the government does a regular check. The government, does spot checks to make sure no one's violating this rule. And it ensures that all wheat is sold at this particular price. What will that result in terms of like what would the impact be on people's decision at a micro level? Well, for people who had the demand for wheat, that demand just completely increases, and that increases on two levels. At the first level, the people who couldn't afford wheat at all, and now they can, so they want more atta, right? And then the people who were maybe not, who couldn't afford it as much as they wanted it, or now they can afford more wheat, and so they want to stock up on it, or maybe their actual requirement was much higher than what they were getting previously, so they increase their demand as well. And let's imagine that that is an increase of 50 kilograms. What happens on the supply side? On the supply side, as we looked at before, your reason to like work in this industry decreases because you're not making as much money. So your incentive declines. And people respond to this incentive by maybe not producing as much because there's really the incremental effort of the additional 25 kilograms is not worth it for them anymore. The cost of producing that is higher than the selling price that it is uh, fetching. So they try to adjust and they bring it down to 75 kilograms, at which point it makes sense for them to sell. What does that lead to in terms of, in terms of uh, the available sort of the mismatch or the respective distance between demand and supply? You will be in a situation where there is a big shortage and a deficit of the commodity that is needed, and so that shortage creates its own problems. And in a if you're discussing this from a sort of social policy perspective, you have to kind of pick pick your pick the evil that you want to deal with, because a shortage is not an easy thing to deal with at a social level. You might have enabled people who were poorer or less well off to have access to a commodity, but overall now you only have half of that commodity in the market because you can't really force suppliers to produce more in a sensible kind of society. And so this deficit means that there are usually you're going to see a lot of queues. You're going to see a lot of people jostling to get the limited goods that are available in the market. And some people would just like to hoard everything, right? Because that a lot of people would actually want to do that because you know that there's a shortage and that shortage might worsen tomorrow, right? So in those cases, people try to hoard. So you would have to implement some kind of quotas. You'd have to make sure that a family can only buy 1 kg of wheat or whatever it is, which means again, like which means that all everyone is getting less of their caloric requirements than before. Obviously, with the advantage of people who are not getting anything at all in the previous example are now getting something to fulfill their requirements. But the disadvantage being that everyone else is kind of losing out. More importantly, in when you're queuing, when you're having to kind of like implement these quotas, and when you're talking about long lines, it is also it is also that system is favoring buyers who can actually stay in long lines, who can, jostle for that kind of in queues for a long time, and that may not be all the kind of buyers that you have. So in those situations, you're kind of preferring buyers who find it like who are physically able to stand in line, and that creates problem for people who can't, who have physical limitations or disabilities, etc., etc. Of course, you can come up with other ways of supplying them, and governments often do, but that leads to its own inefficiencies, problems, and concerns, etc., etc. So that's what would happen if you have a price ceiling. That's the sort of liberal market definition of why you wouldn't want to have ceilings. Okay. Let's talk about um, situations where we're talking about something else. Let's say the government feels that of that let's go back to this being apples maybe. So in the case of apples, the government says for whatever reason, maybe they like apples too much. They say that if we reduce the price of apple too much, then fewer people would produce it and you would have fewer apples in the market. We really need a lot of apples for whatever reason, for whatever their policy is. Maybe it's a good thing that the market isn't appreciating, and so they want more of it. So, what can they do in this particular situation? Well, one of the things that they can do is they can mandate something that's called a price a price floor. So the price of that commodity cannot go below X plus 100, right? Which would mean that no trade can happen at X plus 75 or X plus 80. What would this lead to? This would have the desired effect of increasing the supply of apples because it just makes a lot more sense to produce apples, at least in the immediate sort of cycle after this policy is implemented. But not everyone can afford apples at this particular rate. So you will see some shrinking demand. There's some people who just can't afford it at all, and there are other people who were maybe buying 10 kgs before, but they would only buy 7.5 kgs now because they have other things that they want to spend on. So that's not like the apples isn't the only thing that they're in the market for. And so you'll have a situation where supply is greater than demand. You have more supply in the market and you have less demand, and that would lead to a supply glut, or it would lead to a situation where you have an over surplus. Okay. What would this mean? Well, a supply glut is kind of harmful because even though in the short run people enter the market and try to produce a lot more, a lot of them will not be able to find a buyer. So especially if the goods are subject to decay of one sort or another, they'd be suffering a huge loss. So what that would mean is that in the next cycle, even though you have the floor implemented, in the next cycle, in the tomorrow people would radically, unless there isn't any other adjustment or intervention by the government, um, people would react to the losses that they're having because they have extra 75 kilograms that they weren't able to sell that all went to waste by reducing their supply. So a lot of time, the price floor can maybe in the short run achieve what you wanted to do, which is increase supply, but in the long run, it would decrease incentive and it would very realistically decrease the supply of that commodity because people abruptly try to leave that particular market and produce less of it over the medium term or over the long term. Okay, so as you can see, this has been a rather critical evaluation of price floors and ceilings. And a lot of times you will get this from liberal economists who are kind of against all government interventions. Again, this workshop is not going to be a discussion on different perspectives, but if that is the case, then why is there a debate about floors and ceilings? Why is it that there are other perspectives who feel differently about these situations? Well, one of the reasons is that a critique of price floors and ceilings assume what we call market efficiency. So we say that the market is the best determinant of price. And just like in the examples that we looked at, right? It rewards the right action, it rewards the equilibrium price, it rewards the fair price. And if there's anyone who tries to kind of corner the market, it punishes them out and it reaches an equilibrium. It's efficient. There's a strong market efficiency hypothesis, there's a weak market efficiency hypothesis. I'll not go into those details right now, but the idea is that if someone criticizes price floors and ceilings and they're which call a subscriber of the liberal economic kind of way of thinking about it, they probably place a lot of value in the efficiency of markets themselves. Um, and a lot of times that simplistic assumption doesn't really hold true. So let's talk about agriculture for a bit. Agriculture is a very interesting example to deal with, right? So one of the reasons for that is that in the case of market efficiency, right? People can what market efficiency hypothesis assumes is that people can make adjustments to their decisions. So if a supplier ends up in a situation where they have too much of something, they can, just in the next cycle, they can just adjust for it, or the day after they can adjust for it. But that doesn't really apply to wheat or apples as much. That doesn't really apply to agriculture. So it's a bit of a simplistic assumption to take that and the reason for that is that these aren't grown on a daily basis or on a time span that's shorter. They are harvested and grown and sort of their cycle is across seasons. Sometimes they're across a half a year. Sometimes they're even yearly cycles that you have to deal with. So people are kind of fixed into the situation they have in the short term, and the short term in the case of wheat and apples, like the short term is a period of time where you can't make any changes to your demand or your supply, right, to your action in that economy. It's okay if that short term corresponds to only a day or 2 days in a human's life, because that's fine. You can take a hit in a day and recover from it tomorrow. But if that corresponds to a year, right, then it leads to problems, and when we'll see some of those problems. So let's say in season one, you have a very good year in terms of harvest, and whatever it is that you're trying to harvest, apples, oranges, whatever it is, you have 300 units of those. But for reasons that you could not have predicted, for reasons that might not have anything to do with you, the demand for those fruits is really in decline. That could be because you have an economic slump, and so people are generally consuming less. That could be because some other macroeconomic reason. You don't have to be familiar with it, you might not even know it, but what you're seeing fewer demand, which would you would see if you have a lower kind of if you're at the previous price that you were selling in last season is not getting you the demand, and therefore you're getting a lot of surplus left over, right? So with this 175 kilograms ka surplus, how would you sort of adjust for it? Well, the answer for the market efficiency hypothesis is that you would lead that the way to clear this is to reduce the price. So the market will find its own efficient price and will just go and reduce this, right? Um, but that doesn't really exactly work, because this isn't just a simple loss that apple farmers can take, or the orchards can take. If they reduce this price, if they don't reduce the price, then they have this enormous surplus that just simply goes to waste. So if they're forced to reduce the price, what happens? Well, their total earning declines in that year. Let's say this every season corresponds to 1 year. And what happens as a result of this decline? Well, a lot of the farmers are not able to maybe pay back their loans. They have to sell their machinery, or they have to sell their farms, or they realize that maybe it's not worth their time to invest in apples, and they start growing oranges instead because their orchards are, cross functional, so they go into another kind of industry altogether. or another agricultural commodity altogether. What does that mean for the next year? Well, a lot of times people can overreact to such circumstances. So it's very much possible that you have only 100 kgs produced in the next year because people repurpose their farms or stop growing altogether. And now you certainly have possibly a shortage because let's say whatever economic problems um, that were sort of dampening the demand for apples, let's say they certainly go out of the picture, and now you certainly have more demand. So there's a growth in demand, but the supply is kind of limited because even though you're seeing kind of signals for increasing the demand, but you really can't do that when you're in the middle of the season. You can't go back in time and harvest or sort of sow more seeds for apples. You kind of locked into that decision, which again the market efficiency hypothesis does not take into account. So you're kind of locked into this, and now you have a situation where you have the kind of opposite happening. You now have a terrible shortage, and you're dealing with a situation where price would certainly spike. And let's say our objective was for this kind of variation to not happen. So one of the ways in which, again, a price ceiling can help you um, is that it would, or rather a price floor would help you, is that you can't you can ensure that such kind of radical changes don't happen, and in the next season you don't have a mass exodus of people from apple farming and they continue to remain engaged in that industry. So if you keep the price same, let's say you'll have a surplus. What happens to that surplus? There's a second policy that also goes into effect, which reinforces the price floor. So one of the things that we're going to do here is implement a price floor. What else do we do? Well, the government buys the extra apple and stores it in their reserves. That happens with wheat and sugar all the time. So government in Pakistan has granaries and storage for sugar where they take on they buy the surplus at the price, right? They don't even have to implement a floor. Essentially, they can just set the government price at X plus 75 or X plus 100, and everyone else would have to follow suit because the government is buying at that rate. So everyone else will have to purchase at that rate as well. And by doing so, the government essentially creates a surplus. What does the government do with that surplus? That's something to think about. But let's look at a different kind of situation before we look at this particular surplus. And for this, let's look at wheat, which is a staple diet in most countries and most economies. So, what happens in a situation where, because of multiple reasons, maybe there was flooding, maybe there were exogenous shocks, you are stuck in a situation where you have only 100 kilograms of what you needed, and then the demand for this should be wheat is actually, thrice that amount. But you will see price, you have a deficit of 200 kgs, you will see price hiking suddenly because when wheat farmers would come into the market to sell, they would see and they would, let's say, set X plus 50, they would see too much demand for what they're selling. So they will keep spiking it to X plus 75, X plus 100, X plus 125 until they reach a particular equilibrium. Let's say that equilibrium is at 150, right? In this example, and so you will have a situation where price has risen from plus 75 to plus 150. It says it has kind of doubled, right? So in that kind of a situation, what do you do? Well, as a government, what you want to do is, one of the things that you want to do is you want to implement a price ceiling. And one of the things, actually, before that we go into that, there's a very interesting problem that sometimes happens. So let's say you have an international body that recognizes that there's actually a lot of surplus in another country, in a Western economy, in Netherlands, in US, et cetera, et cetera. And what it does is says, look, what we'll do is give you these 200 kgs almost for free or at a very reduced price or at the same price as X plus 75. That sounds like a great thing to do because the people who are going hungry, who are not meeting their nutritional requirements, the basic caloric requirement. So this seems like a great policy, doesn't it? Right? But there's a very obvious sort of there's a very deep issue with doing this, and I'd like you to pause the video and think about what could possibly the reason why you wouldn't want to accept this help from an external body. Okay, so the challenge that happens is that if you were to manipulate the price, if you were to keep the price at X plus 75 by bringing more grain from elsewhere, it wouldn't solve the essential problem that you have, which is that you don't have enough wheat production. And that might be because you're not allocating enough farmland to it, you're not giving enough incentives for wheat producers. So there's no really real reason for wheat harvesters to, increase their production. In fact, if anything, it's very much possible that you see a reduction in season two, and certainly you won't see an increase in production, which would mean that next year you would probably have a higher deficit here, not a lower deficit here, and so that's where the dependency problems comes in. Which is often talked about in the context of African countries and their problems with food insecurity, and sometimes the simplistic way in which international aid organizations deal with those situations. So you obviously want to help, but you've got to be very careful. You probably should have a very competent economist with you to sort of guide you with how to deal with such a situation, and not just attack the symptom of the issue, but you also want maybe better, you want the aid to be consisting of better ways of farming, or give them higher quality seeds, or give them better ways of irrigating their fields, so that the root cause of the problem is also addressed. Okay, so that's just an interesting digression into why simplistic interventions fail. But what could the government do? Well, one of the things that it can do is that it sets a price ceiling. And what it says is that no one can sell it at X plus 150. The price will remain at X plus 75. So it sets a ceiling like this. And or maybe let's change this a little bit. Um, uh, yeah, so let's keep it like this. Okay. So it says, okay, no one would sell this at 150, which is the new equilibrium. You will all stay at X plus 75. And at that level, there's a problem because you have a lot more demand, let's say, and you have a shortage to fulfill that demand. So where would the deficit be served from? How would you find out? How would you plug the gap between the 200 kgs? Well, one option is you don't. So you just have a shortage, you have long lines, you implement quotas. That leads to a lot of problems. Socially, it's just not a good sight. I don't know if anyone has seen something like this, but during the sugar price hikes, the government had these utility stores in Pakistan, all across Lahore, all across Punjab, even in Sindh, where they would sell discounted bags of sugar. And when the truck would enter the Sahulat Bazaar or the utility store, you would see people sort of jumping on those trucks and trying to get what they want, whatever they could get. You would see a lot of jostling in the queues. You would see a lot of people just giving up on waiting for all of this because they didn't want to you have to throw punches or push people around to get what they wanted, right? So it's a very indignified outcome. It's not easy to kind of play this out. You have to invest in security. You have to make sure that with every place where you're selling this discounted sugar or wheat, which is subject to a price ceiling, you have to provide security. You have to monitor a lot to make sure no one's violating this. So it's not that easy for a government, especially a political government, to be okay with a shortage or quota. So what happens? Well, in the good case, assuming that in the previous season you had a surplus and the government had in fact bought the surplus and kept it in their granaries or stores, um, that's where the government kind of provides a mediating influence. So this time, this is again the good case. It's possible the government hadn't done that, or you didn't have a surplus last year, but the government then sells its reserves in the market. So let's say it had 175 kgs of surplus that it had bought last year. It kind of, addresses the gap to a certain extent, to a large extent, by selling its own reserves in the market. And so it provides kind of a stable influence in markets which are subject to natural unpredictability. This is a very important case for governments being involved in the market, maybe not completely running the markets, but being a very important actor in the market so that people don't overreact to sudden shifts or shocks. And in fact, the government the mediating influence of the government keeps the price stable over different years. This is completely in a completely different direction from market efficiency hypothesis. Here we are kind of saying that when markets are that markets are often inefficient, especially when you're dealing with products and commodities, where you can have sudden spikes or sudden decreases, where you can have a natural disaster and a sudden shrinkage or contraction in production, or you can have sudden contractions or shifts in demand. The market doesn't really respond to it in a way that's fairly efficient, or the way that the way that it corresponds to our social and political objectives, which is of giving somewhat of a predictable life to people, not forcing them to have to suffer the vicissitudes of the market. Um, so I hope that's an interesting kind of take on the matter. And if you have ever come up in a debate about price ceilings and floors, you've kind of looked at both sides today. And a lot of times those debates would then address the specifics of that market. Can we leave to the market to decide agricultural commodities? What are the problem of having this model in itself? What could the government get wrong? What happens when government's own actions in trying to mediate the market worsen the crisis? And there are many examples of this in Pakistan. The sugar industry is a very good example of it. In India, there are all sorts of problems that happen because the government plays an active role. Right. So I hope that this gives you a sort of foundation to discuss those topics. And more importantly, and this is what I'm not going to discuss in this recording, but we've looked at one case where we can make a strong case for why markets aren't efficient in those situations, which is when there's a lot of natural fluctuation. I'd encourage you to think about other cases where markets would be inefficient, right? What could be other situations where you have inefficiencies? What are other factors that could lead to it? And maybe those would come in handy when you're on the side that's supporting government intervention or mediation in markets. And the other side is going all, Adam Smith's liberal economy, laissez-faire economics on you. And so, you can go like, aha, but wait, hang on, markets aren't efficient if this condition isn't met, or if the underlying commodity has these properties, or if one of the answers, I'll just give it away, informational asymmetries exist. So some people are hoarding information and that isn't being shared with everyone. Some people have more critical information than others, et cetera, et cetera. So here's where we will conclude our discussion of markets. And just like in the previous sessions, if you have any specific questions, I'll share my email, and you can reach out on that.